wanted to know why God made you, Jesus has told us. We're created so that we can recreate people for community with God. That's what Jesus meant when he said that we're to go out there and to make disciples of all people. He was calling us to remake people for eternal relationship with God. But then it turns out that the only way to create a community is to do it through communication. You can't have relationships without communication. You see, it comes out in Jesus' invocation. We wouldn't know anything about what Jesus wants us to do, what is God's purpose for our lives, if Jesus did not tell us. He had to say it. He had to communicate it. This is how we know. So there is no way to create people for community with God unless you actually communicate God's truth to them. And that means that in order for people to come into relationship with God, someone has to dare to speak God's truth into their lives. Someone has to dare to speak for God from His Word. The problem is that speaking truth has become somewhat dangerous in our times. Then speaking truth from the Bible could be a real hazard for your life. It can kill you. 30 or maybe 20 years ago, we spoke God's truth with impunity. Being the moral majority voice of our culture built on the Judeo-Christian principles, we went out there and we said what everybody has heard before. People pretty much grew up in the church, around the church. Everybody has heard what the Bible said in Sunday school. So when we went out there and we tried to communicate God's truth, it was a lot like preaching to the choir. But in the last couple of decades, things have changed. From the majority, we've become a minority. We have experienced people coming to us from different cultures. And with that, they brought different convictions and different values. They contradicted the biblical truth, and so we found ourselves at odds with people's ideas. Then came relativism, which demanded that we pay our homage to the new view of tolerance. That tolerance demanded that we affirm everyone else's views and convictions as of the same value as every other views and convictions. We're told not to judge anyone else. Then came the postmoderns, and they've developed allergy to meta-narratives. They looked at language and they noticed that there is a way to use language in which you turn truth into power and power into control of people. So they began to look at language with some suspicion. So the deconstructivists told us that we need to abandon all meta-narratives, all those great explanations of reality that are trying to tie the beginning and end, tell the whole story. Suddenly the greatest meta-narrative that the world has ever heard, the Christian story, has fallen under suspicion. And so, feeling that frontal assault of culture coming against us, we've realized that now speaking the truth has come with a cost attached to it. Today when you go out there and you make those claims that used to met with no resistance, you go out there and tell people the basics about how they can get in relationship with God. You say, you have to come into relationship with Jesus Christ. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. You don't realize that when people hear it today, they hear it as an aggression against their convictions and their faith. Because in claiming that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, what you're proposing is that truth is exclusive. You have corner on the truth, and when you say that, what you're doing is that you're expressing hate toward their stance. These days, when you go out there and talk like that, you can get hauled before a human rights tribunal. You'll have to pay for what you say. So it's not surprised that we have lost our nerve. We have realized that perhaps we need to hold our tongue a little bit more. We need to be careful with what we say. As a matter of fact, we came to the conclusion that since speaking truth, no matter how you try, it could be dangerous. We would do a lot better if instead of saying so much, we did more. We tilted the mission of what we're trying to accomplish away from telling people what they need to do, and instead showing them by doing. You can get those cues from following Jesus' story. I mean, you get into the story, and here you meet Jesus, and he's involved in great social projects, humanitarian work. The first thing he does going out there, he helps people. He empties the hospitals, heals people, he helps people with their mental health. There are losses through death, and he restores children back to their parents. And you can watch that the crowds swell up from one day to the next. And his popularity grows, and everybody loves being around Jesus. Everybody loves it until he starts speaking. I submit to you, it would have been better for Jesus to keep his mouth shut, but the moment he starts speaking, things go from bad to worse. Because the more he says, the more the crowd thins out. And at the end of the day, from all that he said, he ends up on the cross alone. So it's not really surprising that facing the opposition in our culture to the message that once was received and welcomed, churches are trying to redefine our mission in ways that focuses more on us just doing what God has told us to do without saying much, so that we don't antagonize the crowd, so we don't get people angry at us, so that we don't feel so ostracized in the culture. Churches have been reframing their mission statements. Now it's all about doing, not just talking. I came across a mission statement on one of those internet sites from a church that has decided that they would define the mission of their life based on a verse that comes from a book of the prophet by name of Micah. They're standing before people who got derailed in their relationship with God and facing the question, what does God actually require of people? The prophet spells it out for them. He says that what God requires from his people is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with their God. People who are part of that church have decided that these three parts will define all of their lives. So on their website, what you have there is act, love, walk. They have embraced that as something that will define everything that they do. It's exciting, and I think it captures people's imagination, because it's the kind of thing that you can get involved in. It will get you off the couch. The problem is that you can't take biblical verses, just as you come across them and turn them into your life missions. That's because in order to get at the biblical truth, in order to get it right and to find its significance for life, you have to understand what the biblical text says, but you also have to understand why the text says it. If you take what the text says, but you misunderstand the purpose for which God had spoken it, you can misapply it in life. You can put your life to the wrong cause. There's a text in the Bible, for instance, in the 5th book, 22nd chapter and 8th verse of the 5th book of Moses. And there God says that if you're building a house, you have to build a fence around the roof of that house. So if you travel through Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, you see these homes with these little 6 or 8 foot, 8-inch fences around the perimeter of the roof. They're usually built by folks who are deeply religious, and if you had an interview with the owner and say, well, why did you put this little fence around the perimeter of the roof? They would say, well, because the Bible says that. The Bible tells you that you're supposed to build a fence around the roof. And that's what the Bible says. And the problem is, if you ask them why the Bible says it, they couldn't tell you. But when you go back to the text explains why it is that God wanted people to put fences around the roofs of their homes. That's because the roof of the home is a place where people live in the Middle East. So they use it like you use a terrace or a balcony. And to prevent injury or loss of life, because God cares about lives, He wanted people to put safeties in, to build them around the perimeter of that roof so that people wouldn't injure themselves by falling off. Now, most of the homes that you encounter in Europe have pitched roofs. They're overlaid with clay tile, and nobody ever goes up there unless you have to fix something. So you don't live on the roof of your home. So putting a fence around the perimeter of your roof is to misunderstand biblical theology. You know what the Bible says, but if you don't know why it says it, you're bound to miss God's purpose for that text. When you try to derive a statement of mission from a biblical text, you have to know not only what it tells you, but you have to know why it tells you to do something. You go back to Micah, and I hear him a community of people who have given themselves to hypocrisy. In their corporate worship, they were experiencing that Hillsong moment, of great rapture with arms raised, and that sense of being in God's presence, and worship being so fulfilling for them. But when the last song was over and they were on their way home, they from Monday through Saturday, when God looked, they noticed that as much as the worship was a high point of the week, it didn't carry into life. They walked by people who were poor and disadvantaged, people who needed help, and they wouldn't move their finger to help them. So as an antidote to hypocrisy, God says that if you want to get back to the right relationship with Him, you have to start to act justly. You have to begin to love mercy that you offer to people. And you have to, rather than standing there and parading yourself before God, you have to acquire a new humble stand before God. But you notice that the purpose of that text is to deal with hypocrisy among God's people. To remedy a problem. It wasn't a prescription for life's mission. You cannot take texts like that anymore. They can go to the texts that say that you should not gossip in the church. Well, it's one thing to tell people what they shouldn't say, but that's not the same as telling them what they should say. Or go to that text that is written to lazy people in the church that tells you have to work. Well, you have to work to live, but it would be a grievous mistake to take that text and turn it into a life's mission where you live to work. It's not the same. So to go to a biblical text and to take what it says without understanding why it says it, and then turn something that's a remedy to a problem into a mission for life is to misunderstand the biblical theology at best. But then you can really understand why it is that folks would take hold of this text. You look at that list: act, love, walk. What's missing from it? Well, what's missing is the word speak. You see, you can do all these things without having to say much. And so when you look at the calendar of events that is on the internet of that church, you discover that it's filled with things people do. And you see, it's appealing for those inside, and just as it's attractive to the people who are on the outside, the people who want to be part of the mission, we all feel that tension. We don't want to get caught, saying something that will aggravate people, that will get people to dislike us. I mean, nobody wants to go into the store and see people, avoid you in the aisles because of what you said, or point you, in the crowd with the finger as, the radical who actually believes in that exclusive truth. But we love to be part of the mission, so when we reframe it in terms of doing rather than saying, suddenly folks can put their hand to the task. They can feel good about themselves because they can be part of a project and still feel they're fulfilling the same mission that seems to them as biblical as that mission that Jesus prescribed for us to make disciples. And people on the outside look at that and it's appealing. It's attractive. Because in what we do, we try to convince people that we're really, really nice people, that we care about society, we care about culture, we care about our cities. And so, we get involved in projects. We collect clothes, we get shoes, and we send them to the needy people in some parts of the country where they don't have shoes. And then, on a Sunday or Saturday, we stop the church and we give everybody t-shirts, of course, with the name of the church, so that people know that we're actually a part of a church community. And we go out there into the cities and we repaint walls that are scarred by graffiti and, pick up needles from drugs that are littering sidewalk. We do stuff that wins us the approval of the folks standing by looking at it. The only problem with that is that as much as we put all the weight on doing rather than having to say it, the people who get involved in projects often spend their whole lifetime going from one project to the next. And then years down the road, the danger is they wake up and they realize they've never asked about the reason, the purpose for those projects. They've done all these things, but they actually have no idea how to have a relationship with the living God. Because the only way to that relationship is for somebody to actually explain it to them. So no matter how many projects you do, eventually you have to get people into the waters of baptism. In order to get them there, you'll have to tell them that they have to get at the truth about God and about them. They have to know that God is holy. They have to admit that they're sinners. And the only way to have a relationship with God is when they cry out for His grace. Nobody likes to hear that truth that they're sinners. They have to change their mind about who they thought they were, who God is. And sooner or later you have to get to the place where no matter how much you do, either you leave people in this perpetual cycle of doing bigger things and more things without ever explaining to them the reason for why they ought to be part of that, or you'll have to stop along the projects and tell them the truth, and there's no easy way to do this. because that truth is painful to accept. So, in order to ease that tension that we feel that comes from the need for us to stand up and deliver, to say something that comes from the Bible, tell people truth about Jesus, we try to do more and say less. And then on the other hand, when we are looking for a new statement of mission, we come into the biblical text and we are trying to find those texts that would use the language that is dominant in the culture today. You know, find the kind of text that sounds similar to what people are saying out there, so that you will feel like what we do in the church comes alongside of what they do. Because ultimately we like to convince them that what they care for and what matters to them is exactly what we care for. What matters to us is just a matter of clarification. So it is no surprise that when that church in the city decided that they would redefine their life, they looked for a text that sort of echoed the dominant themes of the values of the culture. One of the great values that people hold out there today is that the whole feeling of compassion. It's interesting, when you overhear people talk, there seems to be a lot of compassion on the street for people who are less fortunate, people who have been marginalized. They're on the outskirts of life. There's a desire and the feeling that we should bring them more into the center of life. That's we call it compassion. We call it the works of mercy when you are trying to get them there. We come along and we say, well, that's what you people care for. That's exactly what the Bible seems to care for. That's what we'd like to care for. But the problem is that I think that as long as we keep that lens of clarity somewhat foggy and vague, it seems that we hold the same values. But the moment we begin to clarify these values, we realize that we don't have the same values in mind. For instance, when we talk about compassion, that's because when the people out there look at people and they get the gut turning and they act out of compassion, they want to invite us to projects that can take away the pain from people's lives, make them feel better about themselves. So they watch the drug addiction engulfing the city, and they say, well, what we need to do is to provide safe injection sites in the city where people can continue with their addiction in a safe environment. They invite us into the project and we'd like to help, but the problem is that as much as we say we have the same compassion, our compassion is informed by biblical truth. That we don't think that helping to ease people's pain of addiction will actually help them. We think that we have to set them free. So building more safe injection sites will just allow people to continue being slaves to that which destroys them. And we can't be party to this. Or people come and they see the hardship of people out on the street, men and women getting into prostitution, and they realize the dangers that come with it and say, well, we need to build places, brothels, where people can have safe sex. Because their gut turns for these people, and we feel that same compassion, but because our compassion is informed by the biblical truth, we come and say, we can't participate in this. We can't just go out there to a grade school and hand out condoms to kids, because preventing disease is not actually helping people to live a healthy and holy lives. So sooner or later, as much as we try to resound with the voice of the culture, and we make it sound like the values that we hold are the same the values they hold, we often deceive people that we're about the same project. Take that value out there, that value of social justice. See, the text from Micah talks about that we have to act justly. Social justice, act justly, it sounds almost the same. Until you look at the details of what one idea represents and what the other does, you notice that they're not the same ideas. Because people out there who are clamoring for social justice, what they have in mind is that the way to repair the world is to make it more equitable, bring equality. But the way they want to do it is by changing social institutions and programs. There's minority groups and people who have been left out of the conversation. So if we change programs, if we change institutions, if we enact laws and set policies in place, we will force the hand of people to have to bring these people that we leave outside, to the table so they can be part of the conversation. They can rejoin, what we call life. But what they mean by that is that the social justice is a project that happens from the outside. But when the Bible talks about us acting justly, it demands that we become just people before we go out there and try to actually bring about justice in society and culture at large. So what the Bible has in mind is that justice is not something that happens on the outside, it happens on the inside of us. Because justice is about standing in the right relationship with God. You can't stand in the right relationship with people unless you actually stand in right relationship with God. So when we say justice, we don't mean the same thing that people who say social justice. Because in speaking to them, we have to say, if you really want social justice, you don't want to clamor for justice. What you really need and what you have to ask for is grace. It's grace that puts us in the right relationship with God. And the only people who ever bother asking for grace are desperate sinners. So, in order to bring people to God's table, you have to say to them the very things that they don't want to hear. But I think somehow that we think and we continually nurture this idea that if we can just do enough nice things, good things, the kind of things that align with the culture and resonate with the voices out there, the people can come to relationship with God sort of through osmosis. Then we can remove the scandal and that offense of the truth. What you discover, though, that even in the life of Jesus is that the more he clarified the truth, the worse it got. We think that if we could only make it clearer, that people will see it and they will accept it. But the more we do, eventually we get to people asking for an explanation, and at first we fudge, but then we're forced to spell it out. And when we spell it out, we're always discouraged. And that so many people just walk away angry and push us to the sidelines. Like it or not, the only point of doing is to get people to the place where we can help them to hear God's truth, and there's no way for them to hear it unless somebody dares to speak for God. Some time ago I ran into a pastor who became a pastor of a church in a community. It was an older church, mostly filled with older people, and he wanted to get it up to snuff, rejuvenate it, make it an indispensable part of the community. He came from a church that lived by the dictum that you don't say much. So we took some money out of the church's budget and decided to have a work party where they would, repair a local park that has fallen into disrepair. So they got the church folks to fix benches, build swings, clean up the branches, make it nice. And in all of that, of course, he did not fail to call the local reporter from the community, and he came and took pictures and put it in the local paper. Overnight, that pastor became a local celebrity, and I put that church on the map of the community. As he was recounting what he was doing in the church and how suddenly there's an influx of young families and people came and everyone wanted to put their hand to the plow, he said, we're part of the best community in the world. People in town just love us. They respect us. There have been reports coming for the last several years of bigger and better projects. The church has become sort of a source of all these great social works and humanitarian projects where they get the entire community together to do something good. He has managed to bring the town's dignitaries to these events. The people from all other faiths and all other persuasions have been invited to come and participate. People love it. And every time another report comes back, we hear of a bigger and better thing, a greater event. And it always ends the same way, that folks had an opportunity to be around these good church people. They got a sense that we're not as threatening as we are made out to be in the media. But I wonder what would happen. And that never comes out in those reports. If after one of those work parties, you got all these dignitaries, all the important people in town, all the leaders of other religions who are there to participate in the project, and really everybody around. And you said to them, we invited you here to rebuild a park. But the real purpose why we invite you to these projects is because we think you need to rebuild your relationship with God. We're Christians and we believe that the only way to have a relationship with God is to give your life, to stake all that you are on Jesus Christ, because He's the way, the truth, and the life. We believe there's no other way to God other than through relationship with God. So we create these opportunities so that you and we can come together like that, and we can rub shoulders together. But we wanted to be honest with you. All of these things are just a pretext for us to get you, so that we can get you to see that we are nice people who in many ways want what you want. It's just that what we'd really like is to tell you the truth about God and about you. So here it is. We want you to know you can't have a relationship with God without Jesus. Well, I don't think that has ever happened after any of these parties. If it did, I submit to you that the next time you call a party together for one of those great humanitarian or social purposes that you have, you'd find yourself standing there alone. You do that at the end of one of those work parties, and you come back and tell me what a great community you have. Because I think that as long as we're doing, but we're holding our tongues and not telling people the whole truth about who God is and who they are, we can go from project to project to project and gather the crowds the size of our cities. It's just the moment when we are forced and we finally spell out for people what the truth is. Truth from God about Him, about them, about us. We discover that we find ourselves pushed away by so many. That's why we scramble for some statement of mission that makes us do more and say less. Look, the bad news is that if you are looking for a statement of mission in any other text other than Jesus' prescription for us to go and make disciples, you won't find it. You can't go to a text and turn it into life mission, because if you really want to do what God has purposed for you to do here, I have to go out there and make disciples. And make disciples of all people. So that means that you get involved in recreating people for community with God. And you can't do it without communication. And for communication to take place, somebody has to dare to speak for God.